There it is. It's starting.
Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. My name is Miyako and I am part of the events team here at University Bookstore in Seattle. Tonight we are proud to present author Priyanka Champaneri, who is discussing her debut novel, The City of Good Death. In conversation with Priyanka will be University of Washington professor and DEI and racial equity consultant, Dr. Anu Taranath, whose book, Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World, is available on our University Bookstore website. Priyanka received her MFA in creative writing from George Mason University and has been a fellow of Virginia Center for the Creative Arts numerous times. The City of Good Death has been critically acclaimed, and the New York Times Book Review describes Priyanka's writing as being attuned to atmospheric details, both physical and emotional. Links for tonight's featured title and any books mentioned during the discussion will be listed in the chat. Please submit your questions that you may have for Priyanka or Dr. Anu in the Q&A link at the bottom of the screen. There will be a brief Q&A session at the end of the discussion. This talk is being recorded and can be viewed on our YouTube channel shortly after the event. I will now turn the microphone over to Priyanka and Dr. Anu.
Thank you so much, Mekio. Thank you so much, Ed and Dr. Taranath and University Bookstore for having me.
Thank you all. Hi, Priyanka. It's so delightful to be in conversation with you.
I know I've been looking forward to this for weeks.
I have been spending the week glued to this book and have really been enjoying so many different features of it and have been looking forward to being in conversation with you today. We have probably a mix of people who have read this book as well as people who are just curious and who have stopped by. So tell us a little bit about The City of Good Death. What is this book about?
Yeah, so this book is set in the City of Good Death, which is the city of Banaras, also known as Varanasi, also known as Kashi, which is, as you know, a real city in northern India. And it's the city which is considered to be incredibly iconic and important within Hinduism, because it is said that if a Hindu dies there, or if anybody dies there, they'll forever be freed from that cycle of reincarnation that Hinduism revolves around. So this was something I had known about the city. I had grown up within the practice of Hinduism, as a child, and I had been familiar with it for a very long time. This book is actually set within a death hostel, which is a place that actually exists in the city. Just these very bare bones establishments where folks who have a loved one who is dying, they can bring them to this place if they don't already live in the city, have a place to stay while that loved one completes the process so they can have that gift of dying in the city. So it's set in one of these death hostels and it follows the manager of one of these places. And he's been in the city for 10 years. He's built a life for himself in the city. He has a wife and a young daughter. He's kind of created a place for himself in this very iconic setting until one day a dead body shows up in the Ganga River. Nobody knows who this man is, what he was doing in the city, or anything about him. But all they can talk about is how he looks exactly like Pramesh, the manager of this hostel. And very soon, Pramesh finds himself haunted quite literally and figuratively by the ghosts of everything he thought he had left behind when he came to the city 10 years before.
That's a great summary of this book. I was thinking of how to summarize this book in a sentence. And earlier today, I thought this is a book about dying well and living well.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with you?
Oh, absolutely. But what's so funny about that statement is I didn't realize what it was about until I finished writing it.
I have read that you are the kind of writer that writes as you, that thinks about the writing as you are writing. So it's not like you have a longer arc and you know where the story is going. You write your way into the next scene.
Yeah, no, that's totally true. And, I kind of term it organic writing, very much writing as a process of discovery, where for me, the interest in the writing, the fun of the writing, the thrill of that artistic just journey is discovering, is finding out more about these characters, finding out more about what happens next? You know, my first love, I always consider myself a reader before I consider myself a writer. And as a reader, I'm looking for that thrill of, you just can't stop turning the pages because you just have to know what happens next. And you're so invested in these characters. And that is the kind of experience I've discovered. I didn't know this when I started writing the book, but I discovered in writing this book that I'm also looking for as a writer. You know, I have to be invested in the people I'm writing about, but I also have to be invested in what happens next, because otherwise I'm never going to get there. If I already know the whole arc of the plot and all of the surprise, then I think for me, I mentally check out. There's a feeling of boredom that sets in because it's like, well, I already know. So then why would I do the work of putting it down? Because I already know what happens.
You know, when you describe it like that, about a series of kind of unfolding surprises as you are in the midst of it, that sounds really compelling. It also sounds really challenging, right? We imagine writing often as sitting with a very well-oiled outline and being able to just knock it out. But of course, that is not how writing always works. Perhaps it does for some people at some moments. But I think kind of thinking through that relationship between being a writer and being a reader is a really beautiful one. And one that I never had thought of earlier in my life. I thought being a reader is a particular thing and being a writer is a particular thing. And the two don't quite intersect, except around books they do, but processes look really different. I'm really reconsidering that over the last few years, though. And your description of your writing process is kind of proof that things don't work the same way for everyone, no?
Exactly. And you have to be open to trying and you have to be open to failing and failing a lot. I know you know that this book took 10 years to write. And one of the reasons for that is just these moments where as a writer, you think you know what you're doing, which I've realized is like a telltale red flag. Whenever you feel like, oh, I know what's happening. I know exactly how this goes. Whenever that overconfidence seeps in, that's always a danger sign for me. Because I'll end up taking, you know, thinking, letting my ego drive essentially. And inevitably, I realized I was wrong. This character really wouldn't be doing this. This wouldn't happen in this way that I'm so intent on. This plot point that I thought was brilliant, it just can't work. Or this incredible paragraph that I think is full of these sentences that I really love, it's got to go because it's not serving any sort of purpose. So it's just, I look back at this novel with just so much the sense of just being so grateful for the lessons that I learned because, you know, I came out of an MFA program in creative writing, but I think nothing can really teach you how to write a novel until you actually sit down and write a novel because there are things that you find out about yourself as a writer. It's an incredibly humbling process too. And it also makes me excited in terms of future work. I don't know yet if I'm ever going to be able to write another book. This one took a lot out of me. But if I do, there are things I feel like excited about trying out or doing differently using all these lessons that I took from writing this one.
What is something that you learned in your MFA program that seemed quite different for you on the ground working on this novel, or something that you learned or didn't learn in the MFA program that you needed to quickly figure out how to do writing the novel?
Yeah, I think one thing that writers very often hear, whether in an MFA program or from another seasoned writer, is some iteration of write every day. You have to practice your craft every single day. And that's something that's never worked for me, ever. And I used to beat myself up about it a lot. It felt like a failing of self-discipline that I could not manage to write every day. And in the years since graduating from my MFA program, I've realized that I've become better about sensing within myself when I have a full well. So a full well of inner material where I should be writing and I shouldn't be slacking off because there's something there. But equally important is knowing when I need to stop. when I have been banging on the door, nothing is coming out. And in those moments, knowing when to take a walk or read a book or watch a movie or just zone out, in the backyard and listen to the birds, and just realizing that those moments of recharging and replenishing, even when you're not actively writing, your brain is doing something on its own that I'm not aware of what it's doing, but something is happening, because after that break period within me, equally important is realizing when you need to stop taking the break and then get back to the work. But just keeping that in mind, that there's no, writing every day might work for some people. I know it works for a lot of people, but for me specifically, and quite a few other people out there, it doesn't work. So figuring out, what works instead. And your other question, in terms of something I didn't have from my MFA program, but I had to kind of learn on my own, was really just to give myself permission to write this book, which sounds like a very, very vague thing, but in terms of, I wanted to write a book that had an Eastern point of view, an Eastern perspective, referenced spirituality that I was familiar with, but not in any sort of proselytizing way, but spoke about it in a way that I was familiar with it in my daily life, and that it informed my daily life. But it's not like I go around thinking to myself every day, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Hindu, I'm a Hindu doing Hindu things, It's just like people in this country, if they are Jewish or Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever, you don't go around thinking about it in that way. And yet I think the literature that I had seen thus far that was tailored for a Western audience was very much kind of pounding that nail on the head, that these people, it was that othering effect. And I wanted to write something that was for an audience that had the same point of view as me, so that I didn't have to explain anything. I could use whatever words that were not English that I wanted to, and not explain what they meant. I could talk about various things in terms of cultural etiquette or just social rituals or whatever, and just not explain. I didn't want to have to explain anything, because if I assumed that my audience was somebody who was like me, then you wouldn't need an explanation. It would be redundant. And that was something I didn't come out of in my MFA program, or didn't even know how to approach. It was something that I had to give myself permission and just go ahead and do.
I love what you're saying. And there's a couple of different strands of thought that are arising for me, right? So we can explore a couple of these issues if you'd like. So one is the political stance of being able to say, I'm not explaining. I'm just not. I'm not of the mainstream. And it is a political stance for me. It is an educational stance. It is a writerly stance for me to not want to and not have to explain anything.
Yeah.
Now, how do we merge that political, aesthetic, literary stance with the reality that many people who perhaps are reading your book are unlike you in the ways of their own religious tradition, or their familiarity with South Asia, or their familiarity with death rituals from other cultures and countries, or that kind of cultural etiquette that you speak of?
Yeah.
Over the last 20, 30 years, of course, we have a much wider distribution of literature from around the world, especially for a Western palate and a Western audience. Westerners are being exposed and are being invited to read and partake in the stories of people from around the world in a way that people from around the world have been asked to read the stories of Westerners. In a very kind of unequal way.
Yeah.
And global literature is meant, I think, at its most impactful moment, it is meant to think about what does creating a kind of reciprocity of feeling, what does it mean to create and cultivate and be activated by the lives of people who are unlike us? How do we think about empathy? How do we think about building bridges? These are some of the concerns of that people speak about around global literature. Now, a writer's political stance or a writerly stance of, I'm not explaining nothing to you, or I want to explain lots to you, right? That's a big continuum, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about your thoughts and your process around that, please.
Yeah, no, of course. And I feel like I want to take kind of a two-pronged approach in how I answer it. So one, to put a pin in the idea of like a political stance or the artistic stance and deciding to do that, and then how it plays out in real life.
Sure.
But two, in terms of, and I'll answer the second part first, which is when you have an audience who is unfamiliar, and then what does that relationship look like?
Yeah.
I do believe in not explaining in terms of not diluting, not dumbing down, not, to give you an example, because as you mentioned, if you're from a part of the world that is not considered the Western Hemisphere, and you are reading literature in English, you're subsisting on a diet very much of reading about cultures that are initially at least unfamiliar to you, and you're receiving no explanation about them. So for example, when
the literature is the explanation, that's the thing here.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. But that was how I learned about what a bar mitzvah was.
Yeah.
That was how I learned about what communion was. Or, all of these references to the Bible and everything from Faulkner to Flannery O'Connor. Like, I would be in literature class and my classmates would be pointing things out that did not come inherently to me because I did not have the same spiritual background as them. But it was going into it with, well, I don't know. So yeah, tell me, like, what am I missing, and how do I learn? And then it's a constant accumulation of those layers. So really, for this book, there is an ideal audience in terms of folks who don't have my lens. There are certainly the folks who do have my lens, who I hope can come at it and enjoy it and feel like this is a space where at last they are already accustomed to the language that I am using, because it is the language of culture and custom that they too grew up with. It's certainly for those folks, but equally, I would hope it's for folks who come at it the same way I came at Western literature that was full of things that were unfamiliar to me. And I know this book has found those readers because I have been able to talk to book clubs, or I've seen reviews on book reads where people will self-profess themselves to be the whitest people on the planet. It's what they've called themselves. And yet they quote, have fallen in love with the book and with the characters. And I think for me, it all hinges on character, because you could be writing about a place that's wholly unfamiliar. You could be writing about familial structures, about foods, about, customs, religions, all these things that a person could have absolutely no context for. But if they see that character in a social situation that they recognize, and if they feel empathy for the character in that moment for how they react and the actions they take, if they get to a scene where the character has to make a really heart-rending decision and that reader is also feeling it in their heart, I think then the writer's job is done, because everything else then just becomes not background noise, but it's almost as if it just becomes the stuff that you absorb via osmosis. You're so invested in this character that all that outside noise that you're unfamiliar with, it doesn't really matter anymore, because you're following the character on the journey. And it's almost like stealth. I don't want to say stealth indoctrination, but at least it's stealth education, and that you're learning about them along the way. And I think that's true of film, of documentaries, of going to a restaurant where you're eating foods or observing, different, eating ways, food ways, like different from what you grew up with. I think those are all ways that we can learn about each other and then therefore cultivate empathy. So those were kind of the two audiences I had in mind, in terms of not going to explain anything, but if you can hook them with the character, absolutely, I fully trust that they're just going to continue along the journey. Now, the other thing that you had, the thing I put the pin in about, taking this political stance of not explaining anything, you might have noticed, it's part of Chicago style where if you use a word that's not English, generally it's italicized.
Right.
I very emphatically did not want any italicization in my book at all. And I told I like to think of myself as a very amenable writer. That might be an oxymoron, but that was the one thing I told my publisher. I am not italicizing anything. It's something that I actually detest, because I feel like it's putting these warning signs around the word for an English only speaker and being like, warning, 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 this is a foreign word coming, watch out, foreign word. Whereas if you just put it in there with none of that kind of, so that too is its own stance. Now, I decided to write this book without explaining very many things. And I will tell you that after I finished the first draft, I found an agent about a year afterwards, my amazing agent, Lee Feldman. She shopped the book out in the traditional sense and sent it to every single major publisher in the United States, quite a few in the United Kingdom, quite a few in Canada, some in India. It was rejected by everybody. Was it rejected? Perhaps because it was about this world and there weren't very many clues for somebody who is accustomed to a Western world only for them to hang on to. I don't know, but I will tell you the only reason this book was published is because I, just as a last ditch effort, decided to enter a contest with my publisher, Restless Books, that I ended up winning. And that's why this book was published. Otherwise, it was rejected by everybody. Everybody who could possibly reject this book just told us that they could not take it on. So taking that kind of stance, I would hope that it's perhaps minusculely changed as time has gone by, but not very many years have passed. But it did come with repercussions in taking that stance. Perhaps if I had done the whole explain game, I might have gotten different answers. But I will tell you, I'm so glad I didn't. And I'm so glad my agent never asked me to do any of that stuff, because it would have felt like I was compromising myself at the end of the day if I had done that.
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. Thank you for sharing that. On the one hand, the desire to preserve a sense of authenticity and value for other ways of being and other ways of knowing is what undergirds our desire to not have to explain everything, right? To not always put the Western, perhaps white reader right at the center of our writerly imagination, and to say, actually, the center of a book like this may or may not be you, but I will also stretch toward you by writing the kinds of characters and helping you connect emotionally with contexts that might be outside of your familiarity, yes, but I will also hook you in those ways, right? That is a different sort of contract that you're making with the reader, whether they are familiar or unfamiliar with the cultural context, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. To just have it be, ultimately, where the publishing is far from being any sort of egalitarian kind of system. But if we got there one day, hopefully it really should be, in my mind, just about story, right? Like, not that these are Banarasi characters or white characters or Black characters or whatever, and that this is a Hispanic story, or which unfortunately is still the dialogue I'm hearing. Publishing seems very much hung up on the culture of the moment, the country of the moment. But if we could just get to a place of this is a fantastic story, and not the other context that's all around it.
Right. Or as I heard in some conversation recently, Indian and Indian fiction was hot about 10 years ago, and now it's Zimbabwe, and let's see where we go after this. And that kind of flavor of the month conversation is pejorative, paternalistic, and actually is so powerful because it shapes not only which books we have access to, but it shapes our literary sensibilities as well, right? And that's why it becomes really pernicious to think about it as, well, that was the era of Indian fiction, and this is the era of X or Y fiction, because there's so much power and hierarchy and what gets published, who's publishing what, which books are getting rejected, which books are being picked up so quickly.
And it's so insulting to the audience, I think, for some higher power to be like, we've decided that this is the country where we're going to offer you literature about this country, and we're only going to give you this small menu. Never mind that you might be interested or you might be open to all of these things. It really speaks to a narrow-mindedness, perhaps within the gatekeeping community and not within the audience, because I myself have seen that, my book seems to have touched a spectrum of people in the loveliest of ways. I was laughing when you said, you had heard somebody say about India was hot 10 years ago or whatever, because that was verbatim in one of the rejection notices we got. If Priyanka had written this book when Kiran Desai had written Inheritance of Loss, then we could have taken it on. But
why, Priyanka? Why didn't you write it back then? Yeah, right.
But I just thought it really opened my eyes in terms of it, seeing that entire experience, painful as it was eye-opening, but it was also so humbling. And it's one that I'm grateful for, because it was an education that you could not get in any MFA program, any graduate school, because it made me think, if folks are saying that about this book, we'd love to take it on if only it had been written earlier. Who else are they saying that about? And what other countries and cultures are they denying simply because they don't feel like it's that community's time to shine? So what else am I missing out on then?
As a writer and as a reader.
Yes, exactly.
What are we missing out on, right?
Exactly, yeah.
My own book, Beyond Guilt Trips, Mindful Travel in an Unequal World, was rejected by 34 different presses, I think. I lost count after 33 or 34. And at some point, reading the responses that I was receiving, oh, this is a great idea. You have lots of great credentials, but ... And kind of thinking about the nuances of that but, or what comes after that but, and how that maps out to race and power and gender and literary gatekeeping. And also, in my case, I wasn't writing fiction, I was writing creative nonfiction and an academic text that was very accessible. I think for people to figure out what genre it was in felt really challenging. And we say, don't judge a cover by its book, don't judge a book by its cover, but we are so easily swayed by the very one or two things that we can easily see from something. And if it doesn't quite fit our category of Indian fiction or, academic work or whatever, or queer writing or something, we have so little resilience and capacity to stay with that thought more than just close it off or say no or swipe it away.
Well, and even the box of genre that you just mentioned is also something new that I learned in terms of, before as a reader, I am somebody who responds to book covers. I think we all do, just visually, but I never thought of genre. Like, I'm somebody who goes to the library, goes to the bookstore, looks at the cover, reads the back of the book, the dust jacket copy. Oh, that looks interesting. And then brings it home, but never thought of genre. And it's not until publishing this that I realized how powerful genre is in terms of how the publishing community uses it, but also how limited, because say you're a writer who's writing in ways that defy genre. And I know, like people love to throw that phrase around, defies genre, but of course they need to fit it within these boxes, almost as if they have this like bubble fill-in sheet where they have to fill in which ones it goes into. And for my book, it's been so interesting to see. For some folks, they count it as fantasy. For some folks, it's even been considered science fiction. Whoa. So I'm personally taken aback by those categorizations, but I try to see a good side out of anything. And for me, the good side is that some interesting publications have reviewed the book who perhaps they only cater to fantasy or science fiction. So perhaps they wouldn't have looked at it otherwise. And they've had really interesting things to say about it that even I wouldn't have considered myself. And so that perhaps is a silver lining out of being put into these genres. But I think genre also acts just exactly the same as, Indian writers, Zimbabwe writers, Malaysian writers, whatever. I can't fit you into these boxes that we have. The thought should be, well, we shouldn't have any boxes, or, well, let's make a new box that this one can fit into. Let's not say no to it just because we don't have boxes. Maybe our box system is flawed.
Right.
But again, I don't know
Yes.
that we've gotten there yet.
I love that phrase. Maybe our box system is flawed. I think it's flawed. Absolutely. Right. Yes.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about who you are and the novel that you've written. You have written a book that is so space specific, geographically rich and textured portrait of the city of Banaras, also known, as you mentioned, as Kashi, also known as Varanasi. And Banaras has a particular space in the cultural imagination of Hindus. It is the place, as you say, of people who go to die. And it is a place where once one dies there, you are afforded a little bit of a faster journey toward the next phases of your existence, right? Now, writing so specifically and texturedly about a particular city in India that you have not been to is a complicated endeavor.
Yeah.
It's probably complicated in terms of not only your research, right?
Yeah.
To get to the stage where you can write confidently about the space, but it's also complicated in terms of that larger adage that we hear, write what you know, is something that I've heard in quite a lot of literary circles. I've also heard write what you don't know, but the writing what you don't know comes with quite a lot of risks.
Yeah.
Right? Let's think of white folks who write about characters of color. Let's think about straight folks that write about queer characters, men who write about women. Crossing over identities, especially in a hierarchical world, is not risk-free. There are the politics of representation, and who we are and what we know certainly is a part of that longer conversation. Tell us a little bit about how you, as an Indian American who has been raised in the United States, came to think of Banaras as a place that, of course, you can write about with the kind of specificity that you do, having not visited. And some of your thoughts around that, please.
I will tell you that what you just ended this fantastic question with, of the statement of course I can write about it. Truthfully, honestly, Anu, I don't think that thought crossed my mind until well after this book was published, that I had a right to write about it, or that this space was mine. I was incredibly trepidatious, had a massive amount of anxiety about writing about this place, which, as you noted, I've never physically visited. For folks out there, I'm Indian American, but my parents are from Gujarat, which is a state in India, which is very, very different from Uttar Pradesh, where Banaras is. This has been an interesting conversation too, because for folks who are not Indian, they hear that, I'm from a place in India and they think, well, it's India. So it's India. What's, you could write about anything. But of course, if you are from India or familiar with it, you know how different it is across the country. And just in every single way, language, food, customs, just absolutely everything. And so in some ways, it really is writing about a different country. Added to that, I had the additional distance of, not being somebody who was born and raised in the country. So I had that as a additional degree of separation. I was born and raised in the United States. And just having never physically visited there, and it's such an important and iconic city.
Mhm.
And I was not familiar with very many novels, if at all, that have been set there.
Mm.
I knew if this was something that ended up seeing a wider audience, it would be a Western audience's introduction to this city.
Mm.
So that was a tremendous responsibility, where I saw, well, so you're therefore assuming that you get to be the messenger to tell people about this city. And what right do you have? You have all these tick marks against you. Why would you do that?
Yeah, why
And
did
so
you? Why?
I didn't start out thinking that's what I was doing. I started out, I came across this article about the death hostels. I was so fascinated because I'd known about Banaras for a very long time as a Hindu, but I'd never heard of the death hostels. I was so fascinated that I wanted to learn more about them. And, you know, I'm like a lot of artists, like I have a lot of like things that I'm curious about and a lot of little mini obsessions that sometimes peter out and die, and sometimes they sustain themselves and keep going. This is one where it sustains itself. I just wanted to learn everything because I kept finding all of this incredible material out there, films and documentaries and ethnographies and books of photography, and going on YouTube and just seeing travelers going through the lanes in Banaras. There was so much richness out there. And I was doing it because it was fun to learn about. I wasn't thinking in the back of my mind I was going to write a book. It was just really fun. And then one day out of the blue, these characters started walking through my head.
Wow.
I started hearing snippets of dialogue, or I saw them walking through a lane, and it was like, well, where are they going? What are they doing? They're off to do something, but what is it that they're doing?
Let me follow them.
Exactly. It was where I had done so much what I now know was research, but I didn't think of it like that then. I just thought it was just learning about this place for fun. I had done so much of that and absorbed so much information that I essentially built an imaginary city in my head, an imaginary doppelganger of Banaras, that these people just started walking through and doing things and having conversations. So it became a choice. And I had written enough, you know, in graduate school, et cetera, to kind of know when there was a feeling that maybe there was something there. And I couldn't, so I had a choice. What do I do? Do I just keep hanging on to my fear and the fact that I don't feel like I have an identity foothold that gives me a right to this story? Or do I just say yes to the muse? And do I just maybe just start writing it down, and I'll never show it to anybody. I'll just start writing down what I see, and it'll be a fun side project, and it's probably gonna peter out and not go anywhere. So I chose the latter. And all of this, I'm sure you can see, it was never an emphatic moment of, yes, I'm doing this and this is what I'm doing and I've decided to take ownership. It was never a feeling like that. It just was this gradual snowballing effect where it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger until I finished it and I had a book. And I gave it to my writing group and they thought it was a pretty good book. They thought it was a draft that was good enough to go out and get an agent. So these steps and steps and steps. The eventual coming to a point personally where I felt like I had a right to tell this story didn't come about until after I had done a couple of these types of events and I had time to think about how I wanted to answer the question and really do that self-analysis and reflect. And I realized that there were a lot of things that I felt were tick marks against me. But there were equally things that were tick marks for me. And I hadn't thought of them that way. And those things are the fact that I was intimately familiar with Hinduism because I had grown up within that philosophy and tried to incorporate it in my daily life. I was also intimately familiar with just familial structures and the etiquette and the things that, you know, one would do and not do in certain social situations. And I'd been to India before, only ever as a tourist, but I had been several times. And I have a very visual memory that soaked up everything I saw, things that I've always considered to be universal to the country, like, you know, the banter in the marketplace and laundry hanging out of a window and the smells and all of that. So I built this book out of all of that research that I didn't quite realize was research, but equally out of all of these other things that I had. And the hope eventually was that there's one glaring hole at the heart of it, that I was not Banarasi, that I was not somebody born and raised in India, that I had never physically been to the city, that would be enough to just fill up that hole. And I will tell you, Anu, the ultimate feeling of validation for me came not from the book being published, not from people saying wonderful and nice things. It came from somebody who DM'd me on Instagram, who lives in Banaras and was born in Banaras.
I was going to ask you. Yes. Huh.
Yeah. She read the book. She said she could not believe I had never been there because everything that I wrote in the book, she was walking those streets. And she sent me a picture. She put it up on her account of, she was holding the Indian edition of the book up with the Ganga River in the background and all the boats in the background. I sent it to my editor and I said, that's it. This is the only validation. Yeah. And now I feel much better about it. Although you pointed out very rightly so before this talk began, in terms of me saying, oh, well, did I get it right? And you know, that the power that we give people in terms of giving them the authority to say, well, you did get it right, or you didn't get it right, which is an interesting conversation in itself.
Especially as we're thinking about crossing identities, crossing geographies, crossing some kind of boundary, right? Within the particular milieu of identity politics that we're in now, crossing over a boundary, especially around culture and race, is not easy work.
Yeah.
There's quite a lot at stake in it, and the consequences for doing it poorly can be quite high based on where one is and what one is doing and how one wields power. Right. These are the kind of conversations as a racial equity consultant I'm constantly in not only my classes, but in organizations and in institutions all over. And that sense of curiosity about one another, that sense of, I'm not sure I have it right, but I'm still going to stretch. I think we've lost some of that in this particular moment because we've kind of come back into our shells in some way. We're not quite sure how to keep that fire of curiosity and stretch alive when the realities of harming one another are so present in our lives as well. Yeah. Right? How do we stay curious, but also know that irresponsible curiosity harms people?
Yeah,
it harms us.
There's the line, and the fact that there's so little latitude now for making a mistake. You know, in our social media driven world, you're not allowed to make any mistakes ever. And so I think, you know, I really, really like how you put it in terms of that flame of curiosity. I can see it becoming stunted and snuffed out entirely when somebody's like, well, I'm not even going to try, because if I try, I'm going to get snuffed out. I'm going to, you know, the X, Y, and Z horrible things are going to happen. So why even try? And it's interesting because it's so nuanced, right? Like you can't, there's just, you know, it's a wide spectrum of answers. And I remember having these conversations with my professors in my program in terms of like, well, who gives the permission? Like, and how do you grant yourself permission? And one of my professors was telling me about how ultimately for an artist, you need to be able to say that I stake my claim in the land of imagination. And that is where my authority comes from. And I agree with that. But there are things to still be discussed, you know, as you had mentioned, you know, if you have a white writer talking about a Black community or writing about a Black community, or a cisgender, you know, male writing about a queer community, like how, I don't know how to answer. I'm stumbling a lot with this question because it is a huge question, and how do we answer that, and how do we come at it where we can be welcoming to everybody and not turning people away, but at the same time, giving very specific voices the chance to authentically state their experience because they've been marginalized for so long.
Right. This is what happens in an unequal world. We have unequal opportunities to have our voice take center stage.
Yeah.
And so the politics of publishing, the politics of whose voice gets out there is not then just about, of course, the quality of what we produce. It's also about these much larger hierarchies and dynamics, right? And so no wonder things get fraught quickly. No wonder. So I'm also wrestling with the question that I asked you, because I don't think there's one easy answer to kind of fall on, right? I think, yes, that flame of curiosity is something that's so pressing. And I'm so glad that your flame of curiosity was nurtured and stoked throughout this process, because now we have this wonderful book that we get to think about and partake in and talk to others about.
Yeah.
I'm also curious about when in our lives or in our art do we feel audacious enough or unknowing enough to take that risk and to lean in more, right?
Yeah.
I'm so curious as to what emerges when we feel like we can take a breath and think, I don't know it all, but here I go.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and it's a really great point you bring up, because I wonder if part of the reason folks are afraid to do that is the fear of failure, because we aren't really teaching the tactics anymore in terms of how to deal with failure or accept that failure is okay. And it's part of a growth. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's part of the growing experience. And in fact, failure is a sign that you've grown, that you tried something. I'm seeing less and less acceptance. That door seems to be shrinking.
As we're having this conversation about art and politics, it's also making me think of some of the plot and the story in your novel, right? And this notion that the curiosity of being able to say out loud what's happening, the curiosity and the stamina and the resilience to stay in really uncomfortable moments so we can find more truth. The fact that that doesn't happen so easily is exactly what makes this a supernatural novel, right? The very fact that being open to curiosity, even when it's hard and painful and when we're not quite sure what we're going to find, it's too risky for us in a lot of contexts. And because we shut that down, see how that energy manifests elsewhere, right? It's because that energy is still there. Whether you and I finish that conversation and we figure out, wait, what happened to my sister back then? Which is one of the plots in the book, wait, what happened back then? And or what happened when I left the village and I came to the city, but we fought and I never went back. Wait, what happened? When we don't have spaces to explore those stories with grace, humility, curiosity, that energy then rattles the pots at night in the form of a ghost. That energy comes back to haunt us literally and figuratively in some ways, right?
It's that baggage, right, that we all carry, and the fact that you can tell yourself that you're leaving something behind. You can tell yourself you're starting a new life. But if there are unresolved things, they're always going to come back and manifest in some way or form. And I firmly believe that, either in fiction or in real life. And of course, some of these things take time. We can't all immediately digest every mystery and curiosity in our life. You need time to grow and live and experience new things and acquire new perspectives in order to do it. But no matter what, that idea of that, very prevalent in Eastern philosophy and literature, the cyclical nature of things, that it's not a straight line with this thing in the past and you're getting further away from it. It's a circle and it's all just going to come back no matter what. So you're going to have to deal with it at some point.
It's coming back.
Yeah.
Like it or not, it's coming back, right? This book is about death and grieving. It is also an incredibly hopeful book. How does that land on you, and how did you do that?
I mean, personally, like as a person, I like to think of myself as a hopeful person. I think I have a pretty sunshiny, bubbly, silver lining, grass is greener kind of personality.
Mm,
But that voice when I write is so different. And I've never been able to manipulate it into something that reflects my outward personality. So
mm,
I've decided it's simply my voice. It's whatever's in here.
mm,
And it's just decided to come out in that way. And I bring that up only to say that there was quite a bit of humor in this book in original drafts. It was balanced, I think, more like half between the somber and the serious and the melancholy, but half between this just kind of fizzy humor that I really hope was emulating the kind of humor I like to see in books.
mm.
But in the process of kind of getting through those drafts and excavating the story and lifting out the important parts, a lot of that humor had to
Oh,
just fall away. It was sad for me, but when I talk about like shoving your ego out of the driver's seat, that was part of the process. But the hope was always there. I don't think I have it within me. I don't, maybe not yet. Maybe when like 50 years from now, if I become really cynical and jaded, maybe. Because I don't know, I just had a sense within me, like as a reader, this, as you know, Anu, is a big book. It's a really big book. And to put a reader through all of that and not have these moments of lightness, that's really, really difficult. And that's a lot to ask a reader to do, because you're already asking them to give part of their life to the book, to spend time with it, and then to equally not give any sort of pockets of air or pockets of sunshine throughout. That's really, really difficult to pull off and ask your reader to share in that experience. So there was always going to be some element of that there within all of the other, underlying plot threads. Now, in terms of how you make it happen, I think this is one of the reasons the book took so long to write, because as a writer, you try things out when you're writing organically. Well, what if the character does this? What if the character does that? And as much as you might want something, you might want it to be hopeful in that scene, or you might want it to be funny in that scene. If it's not what the character would actually do, it's never going to work, no matter what. So it was really just this long process of finally learning how to listen to the characters and just listen and be like, is this something that this person would actually do? And just I point to my ears because it really feels like this hearing mechanism within me that I can hear if it's false or if it's something that they would actually do. And hopefully, if I have done my job right and everything in this book feels natural and like something that characters would actually do, then that hopefully will engender a feeling of hope rather than, because that could so easily turn hokey or false or just feel saccharine. Yeah, exactly. Sentimental. These are all these pejorative words to assign to it. And the North Star is, it's got to ring true. And if it rings true, then it will be, that pocket of sunshine, ray of light that I would want the reader to feel.
As somebody who's been recently immersed in your book, I am trying to think about it with different sections of humor, and that's hard for me to imagine, right? Because I can only imagine what I have just read. But I also finished the book not imagining that this was a belabored project as a reader, that even though we were thinking about the end of life, we're also talking about the excavation of a better life now in the present. And I think the juxtaposition of that background of Varanasi as a place where people come to die, the death hostel as a place where people come to die, and the rituals around death, I think the background of that created an even more intense connection to the ways that the characters are either sifting through, burying, or trying to discover a more authentic way of living in this life now. And that contrast felt very light to me as I was reading, right? Being able to see that back and forth. Like I started out our conversation saying this is certainly a book about dying, but it's dying well, but it's also a book about living well in the now.
Which is, it's such a fantastic compliment, because when I think about where my mind was thinking about the city, thinking about Benares when I started, I just was trying to contain the city within my head. And all I could think of was contrasts. These like this competing dichotomy within the city, how you have, it's the city of death, but of course there's so much life happening in the city. It's the holiest city to Hindus, and yet it's also a hotbed of sin with, you know, the red light district and various other things happening in the city, like any other city. Just all of these stark contrasts, the holiest city within the religion and this cursed land that's right across the river. And so how do you make all of that work? How do you bring all of that together? How do you make them all exist alongside each other? I mean, maybe I did it, maybe I didn't, but it was definitely on my mind when I was writing it, just trying to just essentially hoping people would fall in love with Benares in this to the same extent that I fell in love with it, and get the sense that you can never really truly understand it. I don't think. Maybe if you live there your entire life, I'd have to find somebody like that and ask them if they feel they've gotten it. But just hoping to bring that kind of flavor of experience to the reader.
Well, you have absolutely certainly brought that flavor of experience to the reader, to this reader, and I'm sure many, many others. And I thank you for your creativity and your talent, and for this conversation. It's so nice to be in conversation with you today and to learn more about your process of writing and thinking and grappling. It's a wonderful book, and I'm so glad it's out there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Anu. This has been such a pleasure. Thank you for doing this. And Mechio and Ed, thank you all so much for doing this, and for University Bookstore for having us.
Thank you both. I really love what both of you had to say about, you know, the dichotomy of nature and sitting with difficult emotions, but coming through them. It's a very transformative novel that I hope everyone has a chance to read. I also wanted to thank the attendees tonight, anyone watching on the replay on YouTube, anyone who wants to look up any books that were mentioned during the discussion will be on our website. All right, good night.
Thank you all, good
Great
night.
night. Thank you so much.
Bye, Priyanka, thank you.